The stench hits you before you even see the camp. A wall of rotting flesh, human waste, and unwashed bodies thick enough to taste. This is Dawson City, Yukon Territory, 1896. And what you smell is the price of golden dreams. William McAllister doubled over, dry heaving into the snow. 3 months of brutal travel from Seattle, crossing the deadly Chilkoot Pass, and this putrid assault on his senses was his welcome to the gold fields. The 32-year-old carpenter had sold everything he owned for this chance at fortune. His nostrils burned with ammonia and decay as he straightened up, trying to breathe through his mouth. But breathing through his mouth only meant he could taste it instead. Around him, thousands of men stumbled through muddy streets that had never seen pavement. Canvas tents and hastily built wooden shacks stretched as far as the eye could see, smoke rising from crude stovepipes. The snow was brown with filth, streaked with yellow stains where men relieved themselves wherever they stood. Dogs fought over scraps of rotten meat. Somewhere, a man was screaming about claim jumpers. This was the greatest gold rush in human history, and it smelled like death. What William didn't know yet, standing there with tears streaming from his burning eyes, was that the stench would become the least of his problems. In the months ahead, he would discover horrors of personal hygiene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He would watch men's teeth fall out from scurvy, see frost-bitten limbs turn black and gangrenous, and learn that in the Klondike, a man's sweat could freeze to his skin and stay there until spring. But first, he needed to find shelter. The temperature was dropping toward -30, and nightfall was coming. The year was 1896, and the word gold had driven nearly 100,000 people to abandon their homes and march into one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The Klondike region of Canada's Yukon Territory sat just below the Arctic Circle, where winter temperatures regularly plunged to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. For 8 months of the year, the rivers froze solid, snow buried everything, and darkness consumed most of the day. Into this frozen wasteland, desperate men and women dragged their dreams. They brought pickaxes and shovels, canned beans and flour. What they didn't bring, because they couldn't imagine needing it, was soap. They didn't pack extra underwear or toothbrushes or any of the 1,000 small comforts of civilized life. Every ounce of weight on that terrible journey across the mountain passes was calculated for survival and gold extraction. Hygiene wasn't calculated at all. William found a space in a tent with 11 other men that first night. The canvas shelter was 12 feet by 12 feet, warmed by a single cast-iron stove fed with green wood that smoked constantly. 12 men, packed together like sardines, with no room to change clothes, even if they had clean ones to change into. The smell inside the tent was indescribable. These men hadn't bathed in months. Their clothes were crusted with layers of dried sweat, food stains, and the general filth of trail life. Most of them had dysentery from drinking contaminated water, and the sounds of intestinal distress were constant throughout the night. The single bucket in the corner served as both wash basin and chamber pot, emptied infrequently and incompletely. William lay awake in his bedroll, pressed against strangers whose body heat was the only thing keeping him from freezing to death. He could feel things crawling in his hair. Lice. He'd picked them up somewhere on the trail, and now they were making themselves at home. In the darkness, he could hear other men scratching furiously, fighting the same losing battle. By morning, frost had formed on the inside of the canvas from their collective breath. William's eyelashes were frozen together. He had to peel his blanket away from his face, where his exhalations had frozen it to his beard. This was day 1. The human body produces approximately 2 to 4 million sweat glands. And in the Klondike, every single one of them became a liability. Sweat, trapped beneath layers of wool and fur, had nowhere to go. It soaked into clothing, froze solid, thawed from body heat, and froze again in an endless cycle that created a unique horror. A prospector's undergarments could become so saturated with frozen sweat that they essentially became a layer of ice against the skin. But here was the terrible irony. A man couldn't simply remove his wet clothes to dry them. Exposing skin to Klondike air meant frostbite within minutes. So the clothes stayed on, day after day, week after week, month after month. William learned this lesson the hard way. After a week in Dawson City, his wool underwear had become a torture device. The fabric chafed against his thighs with every step, the frozen sweat grinding like sandpaper. His armpits were raw from the constant friction of wet wool. Dark stains had spread across his shirt, despite the cold. Circles of salt and body oil that would never wash out. He tried to dry his socks by the stove one night. They were so frozen that they stood upright like bizarre sculptures when he removed them. He propped them near the heat, too near as it turned out, and woke to find them smoldering. Now he had only one pair of socks, and they were burned. The hole let snow inside his boot, which melted against his foot, which froze again when he stepped outside. Within 3 days, his toes had turned the purple-white color of early frostbite. This was the reality that no gold rush advertisement mentioned. In the outside, as the prospectors called the civilized world, a man might bathe once a week, change his clothes every few days, wash his hands before meals. In the Klondike, the concept of cleanliness became a cruel joke. Water was frozen solid. Heating enough to wash anything required precious fuel that was needed for survival. And even if a man somehow obtained hot water, where would he bathe? In a tent full of other men? Outside in temperatures that would freeze wet skin in seconds? The answer was nowhere. Men simply didn't bathe. Thomas Brennan had been in the Klondike for 11 months when William arrived. At 47 years old, he was one of the old-timers, a sourdough as they called the veterans. His appearance was shocking even by Dawson City standards. His beard had grown so long and matted that it resembled a bird's nest more than facial hair. Trapped within it were particles of food, specks of tobacco, and what appeared to be small living things. Thomas hadn't removed his outer coat in 4 months. He slept in it, worked in it, lived in it. The collar had worn a permanent groove around his neck, the leather shiny with accumulated body oil. His face was so darkened by wood smoke and dirt that his original complexion was unguessable. Only his eyes, red-rimmed and weeping from the constant exposure to smoke, showed any color at all. This man had once been a bank clerk in San Francisco. He had worn starched collars and polished shoes. He had smelled of bay rum and boot polish. Now he smelled of something that had no name, a unique Klondike musk that combined elements of wet dog, spoiled meat, and ammonia. And yet, Thomas was relatively healthy. He had survived what so many others hadn't. Teeth were often the first casualties of Klondike life. The prospector diet consisted almost entirely of bacon, beans, flour, and dried meat. Fresh fruits and vegetables simply didn't exist in the frozen north. Within weeks of arriving, men's gums would begin to swell. Within months, they would bleed at the slightest touch. By the end of the first year, teeth would loosen and fall out, one by one, leaving gaps that filled with infection. This was scurvy, the ancient sailor's disease, brought to land by men who had no idea that their bodies were slowly consuming themselves from the inside. William watched a man named Patterson pull 3 of his own teeth out one evening. Patterson was 23 years old, a former schoolteacher from Ohio, and he used a pair of pliers from his mining kit to extract the rotting molars. Blood poured down his chin, staining his already filthy shirt. He spat the teeth into the snow, where a dog immediately tried to eat them. Patterson didn't have whiskey for the pain. He didn't have laudanum or any other relief. He simply gritted what remained of his teeth, stuffed snow into the bleeding sockets, and went back to work the next morning. This was normal. This was everyday life in the Klondike. The toilet situation deserves its own discussion, though discussing it is almost physically difficult. In Dawson City, there were no sewers, no outhouses, no sanitation of any kind. 60,000 people packed into a valley along the Klondike River, and every one of them answering nature's call wherever they happened to be standing. The snow absorbed much of it during winter, but even frozen waste leaves visible evidence. Walking through Dawson City meant navigating a minefield of yellow and brown stains, frozen monuments to human necessity. The alleys between buildings were especially treacherous, serving as informal latrines for anyone seeking a moment of privacy. And then spring came. When the spring thaw arrived in May, the accumulated waste of an entire winter melted into the streets. The mud of Dawson City became a toxic soup of human feces, animal waste, garbage, and runoff from thousands of mining operations. The smell, which had been merely terrible during winter, became apocalyptic. Men wrapped scarves around their faces. Some vomited in the streets, adding to the problem they were trying to escape. Disease followed as surely as night follows day. Typhoid fever swept through the camps. Dysentery became so common that men simply accepted it as part of Klondike life. Cholera threatened constantly, held at bay only by luck and cold weather. The few doctors who had followed the gold rush were overwhelmed, their primitive treatments useless against the tide of illness. William survived his first spring thaw with nothing worse than 3 weeks of diarrhea that left him 15 pounds lighter and permanently traumatized. He learned to boil all his drinking water, a lesson that many others learned too late or not at all. But the summer brought its own horrors. Mosquitoes in the Yukon are not like mosquitoes anywhere else on Earth. They emerge in May, billions upon billions of them, darkening the sky in clouds so thick they can suffocate exposed animals. A man working without a head net would be driven mad within hours, his face swelling into an unrecognizable mass of welts. The constant whine of their wings became the soundtrack of summer, an endless, maddening drone that penetrated even into dreams. William fashioned a head net from mosquito netting, traded at enormous cost, but the netting couldn't protect his hands while he worked. Each evening, he would inspect his fingers and find them swollen, red, bleeding from dozens of bites that he'd been too busy to feel. Infection was common. Men lost fingers not to frostbite, but to infected mosquito bites that turned gangrenous. And still, through all of this, no one bathed. The summer heat, such as it was, only made the smell worse. Bodies that had been preserved by cold began to actively rot in their clothes. The continuous sweating soaked through every layer, creating a portable ecosystem of bacteria that lived and died on human skin. Men developed rashes that covered their entire bodies, angry red welts that wept and crusted and never quite healed. Hair became impossible to manage. Without combs or brushes, without soap or water, men's hair matted into solid masses that trapped dirt, insects, and debris. Some men simply shaved their heads when they could find a sharp enough blade, preferring the constant cold of a bare scalp to the misery of infested hair. Others let their hair grow wild, accepting the occasional mouse or insect that would take up residence. William found a dead bird in his hair one morning, a small chickadee somehow entangled in his matted locks, frozen solid. He had no idea how long it had been there. The native people of the Yukon, the Hen, and other First Nations watched these newcomers with a mixture of pity and horror. For thousands of years, they had survived in this land, maintaining their health and hygiene through techniques developed over generations. They knew which plants could be used for cleaning, which oils kept skin healthy in extreme cold. They understood the land in ways the stampeders never would. But the gold seekers didn't ask. They were too busy destroying the rivers with their mining, too desperate to find the yellow metal that had driven them mad. The natives watched and waited, and predicted correctly that most of these strangers would be dead or gone within a few years. Personal grooming in the Klondike developed its own strange rituals. Without mirrors, men would pair up to pick lice from each other's hair, an intimate act that became as common as sharing meals. They called it hunting, and Saturday nights often found groups of men sitting in circles, fingers working through each other's scalps, flicking parasites into the fire. The lice never truly went away. Like the cold, like the hunger, like the endless brutal labor, they became part of life. Men learned to live with the constant itching, the crawling sensation across their scalps, the knowledge that their bodies were host to thousands of tiny creatures. Fighting them seemed pointless when simply surviving required all of one's energy. Fleas were worse in some ways. They bred in bedding, in clothes, in any fabric that offered warmth. A man's sleeping roll became an ecosystem of flea activity, the tiny insects gorging themselves each night and leaving trails of bites that itched for days. Some men burned their bedding when the infestation became unbearable, sleeping on bare ground rather than face another night of feeding. William developed a technique that he taught to other newcomers. Before sleeping, he would remove his outer clothes and shake them vigorously in the cold air outside the tent. The shock of cold would stun some of the fleas, causing them to fall away. It wasn't a solution, but it provided a few hours of reduced misery. Wounds and injuries in the Klondike almost always became infected. Without clean water to wash them, without antiseptics or antibiotics, even minor cuts could become death sentences. Men would watch helplessly as small injuries turned red, then purple, then black with gangrene. Amputation, performed with mining tools and whiskey, was often the only option. A man named Sullivan came into Dawson City missing 3 fingers on his left hand. He'd cut himself on a tin can while opening his dinner. The cut hadn't seemed serious, but within a week, infection had set in. He'd tried to drain the wound himself, using a heated knife, but the poison had already spread. His partner had taken off the fingers with a hatchet, cauterizing the stumps with a red-hot iron. Sullivan considered himself lucky. He'd seen men lose arms, legs, their entire limbs taken by infections that started with nothing more than a blister. The doctors in Dawson City, those few who had made the journey north, were overwhelmed and undersupplied. Their medical bags contained little more than whiskey, laudanum, and hope. They could set broken bones if the patient didn't die of shock. They could amputate limbs if the patient didn't die of blood loss. Beyond that, they could only watch and wait and pray. Medicine in 1896 was primitive by any standard. Germ theory was still new, barely accepted by the medical establishment. The idea that invisible creatures caused disease seemed like superstition to many. In the Klondike, where survival depended on practical knowledge rather than scientific theory, most men trusted folk remedies and luck more than doctors. William saw a man treat his frost-bitten hands by rubbing them with snow. This was the accepted wisdom of the time, to restore circulation gradually rather than shocking the flesh with warmth. In reality, This treatment caused even more damage, the friction and cold destroying what little healthy tissue remained. The man lost both hands to gangrene within the month. As the months passed, William noticed something strange happening to his sense of smell. The constant assault of offensive odors had somehow numbed his nose. Smells that would have made him vomit upon arrival now barely registered. He could eat his meals in the tent, surrounded by unwashed men, without gagging. He could work beside men whose odor would clear a city street without noticing anything unusual. This was adaptation. This was survival. The human body, faced with overwhelming sensory input, simply shut down the offending sense. Men who had been in the Klondike long enough couldn't smell anything at all. They had become nose-blind to a world of stench, but their bodies still carried the smell. When a sourdough returned to civilization, the reaction of normal people was immediate and extreme. Trains banned returning prospectors. Hotels refused them rooms. Families couldn't recognize their own sons and husbands beneath the layers of filth. Some men, upon reaching Seattle or San Francisco, were literally hosed down by health officials before being allowed to enter the city. Dental hygiene, or the complete lack of it, created problems beyond simple decay. Without toothbrushes, without any way to clean their teeth, men's mouths became breeding grounds for bacteria. Infections spread from rotting teeth into the jawbone, causing abscesses that swelled faces beyond recognition. Breath became so foul that men would turn away from each other during conversation, unable to bear the exhalations of their companions. Some prospectors used twigs as primitive toothbrushes, chewing the ends into rough brushes and scrubbing at their teeth. Others used salt, when they could spare it, rubbing the crystals against their gums. But most simply gave up, accepting that their teeth would rot and fall out, planning to have dentures made when they returned home rich. Most never returned home at all. The mortality rate in the Klondike was staggering. Of the nearly 100,000 people who set out for the gold fields, only about 30,000 actually arrived. Of those, perhaps 4,000 found any gold at all, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, died of disease, exposure, accidents, and simple despair. William attended 3 funerals in his first month. Simple affairs, conducted in the snow, with frozen bodies buried in shallow graves that would be dug up by animals come spring. The deceased were often unknown, men whose names had been lost, along with their identities under layers of dirt and suffering. One funeral was for a boy of 17. He had come from Boston with dreams of striking it rich. He had died of pneumonia, contracted from spending a night in wet clothes that he couldn't dry. His last words, according to those who had been with him, were calling for his mother. His body joined hundreds of others in the growing cemetery on the hill above Dawson City. The markers, when they existed at all, were rough wooden crosses that would rot away within a few years. Most graves had no markers at all, just mounds of frozen earth that would eventually settle and disappear. The Klondike had no patience for memory. Female hygiene in the Klondike presents a particularly difficult chapter. Women did come north, perhaps 3,000 of them, drawn by the same golden dreams as the men. They faced all the same challenges of cleanliness and survival, plus additional ones that their biology demanded. Menstruation in a land without running water, without privacy, without any of the products that women relied upon, became a monthly crisis. Rags were washed and reused until they fell apart, then replaced with whatever fabric could be spared. The blood attracted animals, added to the ever-present smell, and reminded women monthly of how far they had fallen from civilization. Many women simply stopped menstruating entirely. The combination of extreme cold, poor nutrition, and physical stress shut down their reproductive systems. This was the body's response to crisis, a survival mechanism that recognized pregnancy would be impossible in such conditions. Women who did become pregnant in the Klondike faced impossible choices. Childbirth without hospitals, without trained midwives, without any of the tools of modern obstetrics, was dangerous enough in civilization. In the frozen North, it was often fatal. The few babies born in Dawson City were considered miracles, their survival against all odds a testament to the determination of their mothers. Hair care for women was just as impossible as for men. Long hair, the symbol of femininity in Victorian society, became a liability. It matted, it collected lice, it required care that couldn't be given. Many women cut their hair short, defying the conventions of their time. Others hid their matted locks under hats and scarves, ashamed of what they had become. One woman, a dance hall girl named Margaret, was famous in Dawson City for her still beautiful hair. She spent 2 hours each morning brushing and arranging it, using precious oils and imported combs. The men would pay extra just to be near her, to smell something other than unwashed male bodies. She was a reminder of the civilized world they had left behind. Margaret died of typhoid in the spring of '97. Her beautiful hair was cut off and sold, lock by lock, to prospectors desperate for a keepsake of femininity. 6 months into his Klondike experience, William made a decision that would mark a turning point. He would bathe. The idea seemed insane even as he planned it. But he had reached a point where the filth coating his body had become unbearable. He could feel it, a physical layer of grime that moved when he moved, that cracked when he bent his joints. His skin beneath the dirt was a mystery, possibly diseased, possibly infested, certainly unhealthy. He spent a week gathering fuel, cutting and stacking wood for the epic undertaking. He traded a full ounce of gold dust for a metal wash tub, barely large enough to sit in. He begged and borrowed buckets from neighboring tents, promising to return them immediately. On a relatively warm day, when the temperature rose to merely 0 degrees, William began heating water. It took 4 hours to melt enough snow and heat it to a tolerable temperature. By the time the bath was ready, he had attracted a crowd of curious onlookers who thought he had lost his mind. He stripped naked in front of them, too determined to care about modesty. His body, revealed for the first time in months, was shocking even to him. His skin had turned gray beneath the dirt, mottled with rashes and scabs. His ribs protruded sharply from weight loss. Strange growths had appeared in his armpits and groin, things he couldn't identify and didn't want to think about. He lowered himself into the hot water, and for a moment, he could only gasp. The sensation was overwhelming, the heat penetrating muscles that had been clenched against cold for half a year. Dirt began to dissolve immediately, the water turning brown, then black. He scrubbed himself with a rag until his skin was raw. He used a precious bar of soap that he'd been saving for this moment, working it into a lather that turned gray with expelled filth. He dunked his head underwater, feeling the lice releasing their grip, seeing them float to the surface by the dozens. When he emerged, 15 minutes later, he felt reborn. His skin was pink and tender, sensitive to the cold air in a way he'd forgotten. He dressed quickly in his least filthy clothes, shivering violently, but smiling. That night, he slept better than he had in months. The crawling sensation was gone. The itching had stopped. For one brief moment, he felt human again. It lasted 3 days. By the 4th day, the dirt had returned. The lice had found him again, migrating from his unwashed bedding, from his tent mates, from the very air of the Klondike. The cycle of filth resumed, and William understood that his bath had been a moment of grace, not a solution. He never bathed again during his time in the Klondike. It seemed pointless. The psychology of filth is rarely discussed, but William came to understand it intimately. The constant dirtiness did something to a man's mind. It stripped away dignity, reduced human beings to something animal. Men who had once been doctors, lawyers, professors, became indistinguishable from the lowliest vagrant. The filth was an equalizer, turning all men into the same gray, shambling creatures. Some men embraced it, letting go of their previous identities entirely. They became creatures of the Klondike, defined only by their labor and their dreams of gold. They stopped speaking of home, stopped remembering who they had been. The dirt became their skin, inseparable from their being. Others fought it desperately, maintaining small rituals of cleanliness that served no practical purpose, but preserved their sanity. They might wash their hands each morning with snow, or brush their teeth with twigs, or carefully fold their clothes, even though the clothes were equally filthy folded or crumpled. These rituals were anchors to civilization, reminders that they were still human beneath the grime. William fell somewhere in between. He stopped caring about most aspects of his appearance, but he maintained one habit throughout his Klondike years. Each morning, before starting work, he would take a handful of snow and wash his face. Just his face, nothing more. The cold burn of the snow, the brief moment of cleanliness, became his daily meditation, his connection to the man he used to be. The winter of 1897 was the worst. Temperatures dropped below -60 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds, cold enough to crack the handles of tools, cold enough to kill men in their sleep if their fires went out. During this killing cold, hygiene became not just difficult, but dangerous. Removing clothes for any purpose risked frostbite. Washing with water, even heated water, was suicide, since wet skin froze instantly. Men piled on more and more layers, creating cocoons of clothing that they couldn't escape. Inside these cocoons, the human body continued its processes. Sweat accumulated. Waste products built up. The small ecosystem of bacteria and parasites that lived on every body thrived in the warm, moist environment close to the skin. Men became walking biomes, their bodies hosting populations of microscopic life. The smell inside a crowded cabin during the winter of '97 defied description. Dozens of men, packed together for warmth, none of them having bathed in months, all of them sweating despite the cold outside. The air itself seemed thick, viscous with human emissions. Breathing felt like drinking. Men developed strange customs to cope. They would press their faces against cracks in the walls, sucking in frigid air just to escape the interior atmosphere for a moment. They would volunteer for outdoor duties, despite the deadly cold, preferring the risk of frostbite to another minute inside. Some men slept with their heads under their blankets, creating small tents of relatively fresh air. Mental illness became common. Men who had been stable, reasonable people began showing signs of breakdown. They would laugh at nothing, cry at nothing, sit staring at walls for hours. Some became violent, attacking their cabin mates over imagined slights. Others became catatonic, retreating into themselves so completely that they had to be fed and dressed like infants. The doctors called it cabin fever, but it was more than that. It was the accumulated weight of filth and cold and despair, pressing down on minds that had never evolved to handle such conditions. The human brain, designed for African savannas and temperate climates, simply couldn't process the Klondike. William felt the madness creeping at the edges of his consciousness. He would catch himself having conversations with people who weren't there. He would look at his hands and not recognize them. Time became fluid, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. Was it January or February? Had he been here 6 months or a year? What saved him was work. The daily routine of digging for gold, of hauling gravel and sluicing it for precious flakes, gave his mind something to focus on. The physical exhaustion kept the madness at bay. When he was too tired to think, he was too tired to go crazy. Spring, when it finally arrived, brought relief and new horrors in equal measure. The thaw released not only the accumulated waste of winter, but also the bodies of those who had died and been temporarily buried in snow. The spring of '97 saw dozens of corpses emerging from snowbanks in varying states of preservation, grim reminders of the cost of the gold rush. The cleanup, such as it was, fell to those who remained. Men dug mass graves on the hillsides, burying the anonymous dead in trenches that would eventually become meadows of wildflowers. It was gruesome work, handling bodies that had been frozen and thawed, some partially consumed by animals, some barely recognizable as human. William helped bury 17 men over the course of that spring. He stopped looking at their faces after the first few. It was easier to think of them as cargo, as objects to be moved, rather than as men who had once had dreams and families and lives. After the burials came the burning. Great bonfires consumed the garbage and waste that had accumulated over winter, sending columns of acrid smoke into the bright spring sky. The smell of burning refuse mixed with the smell of rotting organic matter, creating a new variety of stench that would haunt survivors for years. And then, incredibly, summer arrived. The brief, brilliant summer of the Yukon, when daylight lasted 20 hours and wildflowers carpeted the hillsides and the rivers ran gold, literally gold, with the suspended particles that the miners sought. Summer also brought the opportunity for rudimentary bathing. The rivers warmed to temperatures that were merely frigid rather than deadly. Men would wade in, gasping at the cold, but grateful for the chance to scrub off months of accumulated filth. The rivers downstream of Dawson City ran gray with dirt, washed from human bodies. William took his second and last bath of the Klondike period in the Klondike River itself. The water was cold enough to stop his heart, or so it felt. He spent no more than 3 minutes submerged, scrubbing frantically before hypothermia set in. But those 3 minutes removed layers of grime that had become part of his identity. He emerged shivering, blue-lipped, cleaner than he'd been in a year. The sun on his face felt like a blessing. For a moment, standing naked on the riverbank, he could almost remember what normal life had been like. That moment passed quickly enough. The gold itself was a cruel mistress. After 2 years of labor, of filth and suffering and near-death experiences, William's total findings amounted to approximately $300 worth of dust and small nuggets. This was far less than he had spent getting to the Klondike, far less than he had sacrificed. Many men fared worse. Most men fared worse. The big strikes, the claims worth millions, went to a lucky few who had arrived first or had the right connections. Everyone else worked and suffered and died for nothing. By the fall of 1898, William had had enough. He sold his meager gold for supplies, joined a group of fellow failures, and began the long journey home. The return trip was easier than the arrival had been, with established routes and stopping points. But it still took 2 months of hard travel. When William finally arrived in Seattle, he was stopped at the dock by a health inspector. The inspector, a clean man in a white uniform, looked at William with unconcealed horror. He ordered William to strip, inspected him for disease, and then directed him to a bathhouse where he was required to wash under supervision. The bathhouse attendant burned William's clothes. They were beyond salvation, the attendant explained, though William suspected the man simply couldn't stand to touch them. William was given new clothes, simple but clean, and allowed to proceed into the city. He walked the streets of Seattle like a ghost, marveling at things he had once taken for granted. Running water from taps, flush toilets, soap available for the asking, clean sheets on beds. The smell of cooked food instead of the smell of human decay. His hands shook when he turned on his first faucet in 2 years. Hot water poured out endlessly, without effort. He stood in his rented room and cried, overwhelmed by the simple miracle of civilization. The transition back to normal life was harder than anyone expected. William found himself unable to sleep in a bed, too soft after years on hard ground. He would wake at night, panicked, unable to remember where he was. The silence of city nights disturbed him, too quiet after the constant sounds of the Klondike camps. And there was the matter of his body, which had been permanently altered by his experiences. His teeth were ruined, several missing, the rest loose and painful. His feet bore scars from frostbite that would never fully heal. His lungs, damaged by 2 years of wood smoke and harsh cold, wheezed with every breath. He walked with a slight limp from an injury that had healed badly, but the worst damage was invisible. The memories he carried, the things he had seen and done and endured, wouldn't leave him. He would smell something, anything, and be transported back to that tent on his first night, packed in with strangers. Feeling lice crawl through his hair. He would see a dead dog in the street and remember the bodies emerging from snowbanks in spring. This was what the gold rush had cost him. Not just 2 years of his life, not just his physical health, but his peace of mind. He had traded his innocence for a handful of gold dust that hadn't even covered his expenses. And yet, when asked about it in later years, William would grow thoughtful rather than bitter. Yes, it had been horrible. Yes, the hygiene alone had been enough to break men. Yes, he had suffered in ways he could never fully explain to those who hadn't been there. But he had also been part of something. The Klondike Gold Rush was history, and he had lived it. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with men from every nation, every background, all reduced to the same grimy equality by circumstance. He had seen the worst of human desperation, and also glimpses of human kindness. Men sharing their last biscuit with strangers, saving each other's lives from frostbite and disease. The filth had been the price of admission to that world. The suffering had been the cost of the experience. And for all its horrors, the Klondike had shown him something about the human capacity for endurance that he would never have learned in comfortable Seattle. At the age of 57, William McAllister wrote his memoirs. He devoted an entire chapter to hygiene in the goldfields, sparing no detail, holding back no horror. It was, according to his publisher, the most disturbing chapter anyone had ever read about personal cleanliness. But it was also the truth. The truth that no gold rush advertisement mentioned, that no sourdough tale included, that no history book adequately conveyed. The truth of what it meant to be human in a place that wanted nothing to do with humans. The Klondike didn't care about dreams or dignity. It cared only about gold, buried deep in frozen ground, waiting for men foolish or desperate enough to dig for it. And the men who came, all 100,000 of them, paid for their foolishness in ways they could never have imagined. In sweat that froze to ice against their skin, in lice that made their homes in human hair, in teeth that fell out one by one, in diseases that killed more surely than any winter cold, in the accumulated filth of months, years, lifetimes compressed into that brief, brutal moment called the Gold Rush. William McAllister lived to be 73 years old. He died in his Seattle home, in a clean bed, with indoor plumbing just down the hall. His last thoughts, according to his daughter who was with him, were of the Klondike. He smiled, she said, as if remembering something both terrible and precious. Perhaps he was remembering that moment in the washtub, the first real bath in months, the water turning black with dirt. Perhaps he was remembering the feeling of clean skin, brief as it was, and the hope that had come with it. Or perhaps he was remembering the smell, that wall of stench that had greeted him on his first day in Dawson City. The smell that had seemed so horrible then, and that he had eventually stopped noticing entirely. The smell that had become, in a strange way, the smell of adventure. Either way, his smile remained as he passed. A smile of a man who had seen the worst that human experience could offer and had found in it something worth remembering. The Klondike is empty now. The gold is gone, dug out by machines that made human labor obsolete. The tent cities have vanished. The wooden shacks have rotted away. The graves on the hillside have sunk into the earth and been forgotten. But the land remembers. The rivers that ran brown with human waste now run clear again. The forests that were stripped for fuel have regrown. The permafrost, disturbed by thousands of mining operations, has healed over the scars. And somewhere, in the archives of history, the stories of men like William McAllister wait to be told. Stories of filth and endurance, of dreams and disappointment, of the terrible price that gold demanded from those who sought it. These stories matter because they are true, because they remind us of what humans can endure when driven by desperation or desire, because they strip away the romance of history and show us the reality beneath, a reality of lice and frostbite and rotting teeth. The next time you step into a hot shower, think of William McAllister. Think of his 2 years without bathing, his lice-infested hair, his clothes frozen with sweat. Think of the men who died of infections from minor cuts, the women who gave birth in canvas tents, the thousands who lie in unmarked graves on Yukon hillsides. Think of the smell that greeted every newcomer to Dawson City, that wall of human stench that announced better than any sign what the gold fields had become. Think of what it meant to be human in a place that stripped away every comfort, every dignity, every small ritual of civilization. And be grateful for soap. Be grateful for toilet paper, that humble product that the prospectors would have traded gold for. Be grateful for running water and flush toilets and the whole invisible infrastructure of sanitation that makes modern life possible. Because in 1896, in the Klondike gold rush, these things didn't exist. And men and women lived anyway, suffered anyway, dreamed anyway. Their hygiene was disgusting by any standard, but their courage was extraordinary. And perhaps, in the end, that's what matters most about the Klondike. Not the gold, most of which ended up in banks and jewelry stores and dentists' offices. Not the suffering, which faded with time as it always does, but the courage of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and somehow survived. William McAllister was one of them. He went to the Klondike seeking gold and found instead a story worth telling. A story of the disgusting reality behind the golden dreams. Now you know that story too.